Hi, this is a short video about the history of the Alumni Association. I'm Scott Alberts. I'm president of the Alumni Association from 1999 to 2021. I'm recording this in September 2020 in the middle of all the COVID stuff. But I thought that this would be a good thing to go through. Most of the material that's here was developed by Danielle Young, working with other folks. I did some of it. I worked with the archives a little bit. And in fact, I did this years ago, which we can talk about some other time. So I think most of you know that we're among the oldest alumni associations in America. People like to argue about which one is first, but 1839 is the date on our logo. And, you know, that's the date that we go with. And, you know, we've been active pretty much since then. And there are very few colleges that have an association that has been as active for as long a time as us. When we first started, it was a very loose group. One of the things I read called it a junta rather than an association, which is sort of fun. Maybe we're a junta sometimes as well. It was a wholly separate group from the college. They elected officers annually, and their main job was to pick the alumni speakers for commencement. And they also did some informal things. They would meet with students and try to encourage them to come here. They did a little bit of fundraising, but the main thing they did was they picked the alumni speakers. Interesting, one reason why we have our fantastic commencement reunion weekend all at one time, which is a huge undertaking. And I think if you talk to folks, almost no school does it this way. And the reason why we do is because for the first 100 years or so, the Alumni Association picked the commencement speaker. It was always an alum. And so all of his, it was always a guy, his friends came back at commencement, which turned into a party, which is what turned into the reunion. So when we talk about the history of commencement reunion weekend, we're really saying that the two events were thought of as inseparable for many, many years at the college. And again, this sort of informal arrangement worked pretty well for a pretty long time. Of course, the Civil War came along and things got sort of crazy. The late 1800s was when the membership started to grow. It started to actually become organized. It became an actual organized charity in the state of Ohio and somewhere in there in the 1860s. The first alumni elected trustees were elected in 1879. One of the funny stories about that is that they changed the college charter to elect the trustees in 1879, but they forgot to file the paperwork with the state of Ohio. So in 1890, they realized it was wrong and the state was very grouchy because we weren't following our college charter. But anyway, it's all fixed. And of course, it's now going on 140 some years of doing this in the official sense. This was the first time that we had alumni donations collected. They were all done through the association, which remember was a separate charity, not affiliated with the college. At the same time, the commencement program started to get bigger and bigger. And when we think about what our magazine is today, the Alumni magazine, which I think we all love, it grew out of the commencement program. So if you imagine the graduates would get the list of things and who the commencement speaker and all that, that was what the Alumni magazine was. And so again, this idea that commencement reunion weekend was really the center of the Alumni Association. Moving into the 20th century, the association is still an independent group, but they start working much more closely together. The college at this point is starting to actively try to get input from the faculty or from the alumni as the college starts to grow, as they start to move forward into a more modern thing, to move away from being really mostly a church school into the thing that is much more familiar to us today. The first regional clubs happened here. In 1905, the Alumni magazine went from being just the commencement program to an actual magazine that was mailed out to all alum. It included the class letters, which was went year by year, just like we still have in the association. One fun story at this point is that Catherine Wright, who lots of you know about, she was the Wright brothers' sister. The physics building at Oberlin is named for Catherine Wright. She was a trustee for many, many years. There were no term limits or anything, and she was a trustee for many, many years. And for a long time, she and Charles Martin Hall, who of course founded Alcoa, and Hall Auditorium is named after him, they were the only two donors to the college. Now you're saying that's crazy. There must have been thousands of alum who donated. And they did, but they all donated to the Alumni Association. So all fundraising, including the annual reunion gifts and all of the other fundraising, except for these two major donors, would donate their money to the Alumni Association, and then it as a charity would donate money to the college, typically for specific things. Catherine Wright is actually on record in the in the Board of Trustees minutes as complaining about this because the alumni priorities were not always the same as the Board of Trustees priorities. So the alumni would give money for a building and the trustees would say, well, we don't want to build a building like that. And then the alumni would, say, well, we're not giving you the money then. That sort of thing. And the other part of that that's really interesting is Catherine Wright, at the end of each year, she would write a check to cover the deficit that the college had. So instead of imagining that you were paying out of an endowment like we do today, she, as a certified rich person, right, she had the Wright brothers' fortune. The Wright brothers both died relatively young and she had their money. At the end of the year, the college president would say, hey, we're, however many $1,000s in the hole, and she would just write a check to cover it. And she actually was on quote saying, why should I have to cover the budget shortfall each year because the alumni want to fund such specific things? And of course, that's still a concern that we have in fundraising today and true at the school I work at as well as at schools like Oberlin, that the funding priorities that the college has and that the donors have might not be the same. The college continued to grow. At the time, alumni elected trustees, again, they're continuing to happen. The first alumni council was elected in the 1920s. The first paid employee started in 1921. Again, they're getting closer together. They started renting space on campus, but literally this charity paid the college to rent an office, and they would use it that way. Moving into the middle of the 20th century, the relationship is still quasi-independent. The alumni council members were elected from the different constituencies. Class presidents elected some, the different regional clubs elected some, which is actually not that different from what we do today. They started their first career counseling, and they now have a staff of 4 people. Also at this time was when alumni elected trustees, they went to a more complicated process. Before that, it was just a write-in process. So what happened was you had to write a letter to the college to nominate someone, and the 2 candidates who had the most nominations would be on the ballot. The trustee search committee was set up about this time in the 1940s, and the idea was that the candidates with the most nominations would be on the ballot, but then the trustee search committee could add additional names to make the election competitive. And sometimes they would pick the second name on the list, but sometimes they would pick somebody quite different. And that's sort of an interesting historical note as well. Moving forward from there, of course, now we have people who are still alive and remembering this idea. In the 1960s, we moved our finances into the college. So in a sense, even though we were a separate charity, the college actually managed all of our money. We had our first female president. Of course, that's Dewey Ward. The Alumni Center is named for her. And they start doing this. And again, it's very organic how the association went from being this separate charity to really becoming this integrated group that we have now. Starting in the 80s was when the association really started to expand. We had the Alumni Council really started to grow. It went from having 15 people to having up to 200. We started to have advisory committees in a variety of different areas. This sometimes caused trouble because, again, we would give advice that the college didn't necessarily want. There are actually famous stories from the 80s all the way up until 2010 where the conservatory committee was famously good at giving advice that no one in the conservatory actually wanted. The Alumni magazine moved in 1985 into the communications office. Before that, it was published by the Alumni Association. Our magazine committee was actually a very powerful committee because they really managed the magazine itself. And thinking about this time, you figure Midge Brittingham, who died this year, she was the executive director for over 30 years, from 1970 to 2004. We had Laura Goby, who again passed away this year, was there for 4 years. And then Danielle was the executive director for about 14 years. And so, Terry, our still new executive director, is only the 4th executive director in my lifetime. And I know I like to think that I'm young, but that's not really as true as it used to be. Anyway, by 2014, the Alumni Council had grown to over 200 members, and it was really too big to be a legislative group. So the executive committee of the Alumni Council, which were the committee chairs and some other representatives, really did most of the organization's business, the association's business. So in 2014, we restructured into the model that we have today. And it's a 27-member Alumni Leadership Council. It has this decentralized structure where instead of having all of these standing committees that we used to have, we make these working groups and task forces that can change. All of our advisory committees were exploded and replaced by liaisons. We actually think we're going to move back and maybe have a couple more committees here in the next year or two, but we want to be really thoughtful about that. And I would say right now is when we're really figuring out what we're going to do now, that we've done the restructuring. We've had this transitional period. We have a new vice president, new assistant vice president. Carmen is still relatively young in her presidency. They have the One Oberlin initiative. What are we going to be known for? What will be the little green name of the period that the PowerPoint 100 years from now will refer to this? The current structure that we've come out with really focuses on figuring out how we share decision-making authority. One model people use is this idea that you think about who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and who's informed of the decision. And the role where the Alumni Association plays the biggest role is with alumni elected trustees. We're responsible for making sure that the best trustees possible can be on the board. And 6 of the 30 trustees are chosen in this way. The number actually sometimes fluctuates. The trustee search committee, we trust to really take the leadership role in that. It's actually weird that I was chair of that for a few years because it is such an important committee. The process is very long and detailed. All of our nominees are vetted in great numbers. The biggest complaint we hear about alumni elected trustees is both candidates are so awesome. How can I pick between them? And that's why about 5 years ago, we added the I support both candidates choice. It is true that there is some variation with this. There is some chance to grow. I'm going to actually